You arrive in the quiet dark of a world that existed long before the first stone pyramid, long before the Maya wrote their histories, and long before the Mexica built their island capital. You step into a Mesoamerica where the most shocking truths hide in the soil beneath your feet. You might not expect that some of the earliest traces of chocolate drink come from pottery older than many written civilizations, or that the humble maize you know today was once a grass so thin and nearly useless that it took thousands upon thousands of years of patient tending to turn it into a staple powerful enough to sustain entire empires. You probably would not guess that some of the earliest villages in this region practiced forms of agriculture older than the invention of iron tools, or that communities survived droughts by storing seeds inside clay-lined pits sealed with layers of ash and woven reeds. And here, in the stillness, you realize something almost unsettling. Before scribes carved a single glyph or nobles planned a single monument, you would have encountered ordinary people, farmers, hunters, toolmakers quietly shaping one of the most complex cultural regions on Earth. No kings, no empires, no grand armies, just small groups of families whose daily labor would quietly plant the foundations for what became Mesoamerica's vast and layered history. Welcome to History in Ashes, where you and I sift through the past one forgotten detail at a time. Tonight, you are stepping into the entire history of Mesoamerica, from its faint beginnings to the rise and collapse of great powers. We cover everything about history on this channel, from the monumental to the mundane, because the truth is that the boring details, how people cooked, how they built storage pits, how they counted the days, are often the things that changed the world most. Before we move deeper into this story, if you could gently drift down to the comments section and tell us where you are watching from and what time it is there, it would help us understand the sleepy map of this channel's audience. And, while you are down there, consider subscribing. Think of it this way. Maize took thousands of years to survive, because early farmers kept supporting it. If you do not support this channel, it might go extinct far faster than early corn ever did. But I promise I won't linger on that. Now, back to your slow walk through these early millennia. You begin in a world where most communities are tiny, scattered, and constantly adapting. The early inhabitants of Mesoamerica were expert foragers long before they were farmers. Their survival depended on a broad knowledge of the landscape, which plants were edible during the dry season, where to find obsidian flakes washed downriver, and how to track small game through dense forests. Their shelters were simple, made from wood and grasses, meant to be rebuilt often. And yet, even in these simple structures, you can sense a patient, deep-thinking ingenuity. People learned how to burn small clearings to encourage the growth of useful plants. They learned which roots cured stomach sickness and which ones merely tasted bitter. They developed small rituals around planting and harvesting, not elaborate religions, but early gestures toward understanding the cycles that governed their lives. Imagine yourself sitting beside one of those fires, listening as a family roasts squash seeds, while elders remind children when to gather wild beans and when to leave patches untouched so they could reseed. There is something calming in the rhythm of it, a quietness that contrasts sharply with the grand cities that would rise thousands of years later. The earliest domestication of maize may be one of the most crucial yet painfully slow processes ever undertaken by ancient humans. Early maize, called teosinte, was hardly larger than a finger and had kernels enclosed in hard shells that needed to be cracked open one by one. Yet people kept choosing certain plants, saving certain seeds, planting in slightly different soils. Season after season, generation after generation, they shaped a plant that began shaping them. Food security expanded. Villages grew slightly larger. People stayed in one place a little longer. The tiniest changes in diet allowed for experimentation. Storage pits, grinding stones, pottery shaped by hand and fired in open flames. By the time pottery appears in the archaeological record, you can almost feel life slowing into a steadier rhythm. Pottery means you can cook differently, boiling instead of roasting. It means you can store grain longer. It means a household has something durable, something that stays with them through seasons of abundance and seasons of drought. In a region where the rains could be generous one year and stingy the next, this mattered. Over time, these early villages began forming networks, not empires, just thin threads of familiarity across distances walked over days and weeks. One group traded obsidian blades for shells brought from far coasts. Another exchanged seeds for pigments. None of these small exchanges would have looked impressive to the modern eye, yet they quietly built the groundwork for later trade routes and ceremonial centers. You can imagine a young traveler walking between villages, carrying a small basket of seeds or beads, learning new words as he walked, listening to different accents, seeing how each community shaped its tools just a little differently. And yet, beneath all these tiny details, something even more important was happening: the birth of shared ideas. People began developing similar ways of tracking days, observing stars, burying their dead, and constructing the first ceremonial mounds. These were not pyramids yet, not even close, but they were deliberate shapes, small elevated spaces where communities gathered for rituals no longer purely practical. This suggests something powerful. People were beginning to think about order, time, and meaning in ways that reached beyond daily survival. You can see this shift most clearly in the early calendars. Long before cities emerged, people tracked the seasons, using repeated observations of the sun's position at sunrise and sunset. Wooden posts were aligned with certain stars, shadows were noted. These practices would eventually create the complex calendars of later Mesoamerican societies. But at this early stage, they were simple, local, and deeply tied to the agricultural rhythm. Imagine someone patiently marking a line in the dirt with a stick every morning, watching the sun gradually shift over weeks. It seems dull, repetitive, but such dull repetition is what made farming predictable, rituals meaningful, and communities stable. Another important development was the gradual shift from small clusters of huts to more organized village layouts. Archaeological evidence shows that houses began being arranged around open plazas where people met, worked, or prepared food together. These plazas are sometimes dismissed as uninteresting compared to later monuments, but in reality, they represent the beginning of shared political life. A plaza is a space for decision-making, for settling disputes, for planning planting seasons, and for teaching children. It is the first ingredient in the recipe that eventually produces cities. You might lean back now and imagine the sensory world of these early communities: the smell of drying maize, the sound of grinding stones smoothing kernels into coarse flour, the quiet hum of conversations about rainfall or pests, or a neighbor's new pottery design. Even the smallest decisions carried weight because these people lived so close to the edge of scarcity. A bad harvest meant hunger. A broken pot meant hours of labor lost. A failed rain ritual might fracture trust within a group. Yet people endured, adjusted, and kept building on the knowledge of past generations. And as these small villages became slightly more complex, something else began to happen. People began constructing the first early ceremonial structures. These were not yet monumental stone pyramids, but earthen mounds packed tightly with layers of clay, gravel, and soil. They required cooperation. Dozens or even hundreds of people shaping dirt baskets, forming slopes, smoothing surfaces. The purpose is still partly mysterious. Some may have been ritual platforms, others burial sites, others community landmarks. Whatever their purpose, they marked a shift from the purely practical to the symbolic. You might be tempted to overlook a mound of dirt, but these early constructions reveal a crucial truth. People were beginning to see their world as something that could be shaped intentionally, not merely survived. By the end of this early period, Mesoamerica was no longer just a scattering of isolated communities. It was becoming a region of shared ideas, foods, rituals, and tools. The foundations of later civilizations were already firmly planted, even if no one then could imagine how far those seeds would grow. You, standing at the edge of a small village, might look at these early farmers and wonder if they understood that they were building a world that would later astonish historians. But as the soft evening smoke rises from cooking fires and the last daylight slides behind the hills, one question lingers. How did these tiny, fragile beginnings eventually give rise to the first great civilization of Mesoamerica? You step forward into a world that feels both familiar and strangely distant. The early villages behind you have settled into memory, and ahead lies a new landscape shaped by slow, steady transformations. You are entering the age when communities across Mesoamerica began converging into something more cohesive, more recognizable, and ultimately more influential. This is the rise of the Olmec world, though, of course, they did not call themselves that. The name comes from later people. In their own time, they were simply farmers, artisans, leaders, and wanderers who lived in places where rivers twisted through wetlands and hills rose softly over plains. What surprises many listeners, maybe surprises you right now, is that the Olmec world did not begin with colossal stone heads or monumental art. It began with careful experiments in farming, intensified trade, and quiet innovations that accumulated like layers of clay on a pot. If you imagine this period as a dramatic explosion of civilization, you miss its real nature. It was slow, cautious, deliberate. Most households spent their days grinding maize, shaping tools, drying fish near riverbanks, and nursing infants during humid storms. And yet, each of those ordinary routines contributed to the emergence of one of the most influential cultures in the entire region. You find yourself near the Gulf Coast lowlands, where the heat wraps around you like a heavy cloth. The air carries the smell of wet earth, and you can hear the distant croak of frogs hiding in marshes. The ground beneath your feet is rich with volcanic soils washed down from distant hills. In these conditions, maize grows well, but so do squash, beans, cacao, and a surprising variety of herbs. People living here understood the land intimately. They knew which stretches flooded every year and which ridges stayed dry enough for dwellings. It is no accident that this environment supported some of the earliest large, organized communities. Daily life in these early Olmec centers, places like San Lorenzo and later La Venta, would not strike you as dramatically different from life in earlier villages, but the rhythms were more coordinated. You might see families living in clusters of houses arranged intentionally around open areas. You would notice specialized buildings for storage, perhaps raised slightly above the ground to keep insects at bay, and you would see more hierarchy emerging. Certain households storing more goods, others crafting pottery in distinct styles, some handling trade with distant communities. Trade was one of the quiet engines of this period. People here carved stone tools from basalt quarried many miles away, a material so heavy that transporting it required immense cooperation. They gathered jade-like minerals, brilliantly green and impossibly hard, from far southern regions. They obtained obsidian blades from volcanic zones far inland. None of these materials appeared naturally in the Gulf lowlands. That means people were moving, walking, paddling along rivers, and carrying loads across difficult landscapes. You might picture a young trader lifting a heavy block of stone, testing its weight, and imagining the long journey ahead, days on foot, nights spent beside campfires, and constant decisions about which route avoided swampy ground or unfriendly neighbors. And in exchange, they offered salt from coastal flats, dried fish, shell ornaments, pottery, pigments, and possibly even early cacao products. These were not luxury items in the sense we imagine today. They were instead the connective tissue that linked communities across Mesoamerica. The Olmec world grew not through conquest, but through influence, through the slow spread of ideas, objects, and shared practices. As communities grew larger, the organization of labor became more visible. Imagine watching a group of workers clearing a patch of land for agriculture. They use stone axes sharpened on river rocks, chopping through thick vegetation. Behind them, others gather fallen branches and pile them for burning. Still others dig planting holes with sharpened sticks hardened by fire. The work is repetitive, demanding, and often dull, but without this repetition, nothing monumental could emerge. It was this steady, disciplined labor that made larger settlements possible. Households specialized in different forms of craftsmanship. Some crafted pottery with distinct curving lines and polished surfaces. Others chipped obsidian until it fractured into razor-sharp flakes. Still others created small figurines, human faces with downturned mouths, animals with exaggerated features, creatures bridging the line between natural and symbolic. These figurines appear in burials, in households, and in public spaces, suggesting they carried meanings that mattered deeply to the people who made them. Across these villages, you begin to see signs of emerging leadership. Not kings, as we would later recognize them, but individuals who coordinated labor for larger projects, managed trade relationships, or oversaw rituals. Their influence might have come from knowledge how to interpret the calendar, how to conduct certain ceremonies, how to negotiate with distant groups. Leadership grew from expertise rather than inherited power. And because of this, communities could shift and reorganize depending on who held knowledge at any given time. One of the defining characteristics of the Olmec world was its connection to ritual spaces. Early ceremonial centers began as modest platforms of earth, shaped carefully by workers using woven baskets to carry soil. Over time, these platforms grew larger, more complex, and more deliberate in their orientation. You might walk across one of these great raised surfaces and notice something subtle. The layout aligns with celestial movements. Certain structures face sunrise on specific days. Others mirror the position of surrounding hills or rivers. The architecture was not meant to dominate the land, but to harmonize with it. If you were standing at San Lorenzo during its height, you might see wide plazas where people gathered for rituals. These gatherings did not feel like the bustling ceremonies of later civilizations. They were quieter, more intimate. People brought offerings, shells, stone tools, food, and placed them carefully in designated spaces. Priests or ritual leaders might burn copal resin, letting its sweet smoke rise. And somewhere in the distance, half-carved monuments lay in the shade, waiting to be shaped into the colossal heads that would eventually astonish future generations. Those colossal heads are among the most iconic symbols of the Olmec world. But to people living then, they were simply one more way to honor leaders or ancestors. Imagine the effort involved. Massive basalt boulders quarried miles inland, transported by teams of people rolling them on logs or dragging them across prepared paths. Workers carved them using only stone tools, slowly smoothing faces, helmets, and features that appear strikingly individualized. Were they portraits of rulers, of ancestral heroes, or something else entirely? Scholars still debate, and you, standing before one of these massive stones, might feel the same uncertainty. The presence is undeniable, but the meaning remains partly hidden. Daily life in Olmec communities was not dominated by monumental art, however. It revolved around practical tasks: cooking, weaving, fishing, foraging, and tending small gardens near homes. Women ground maize for hours each day, turning kernels into dough. Men fished with nets woven from plant fibers. Children helped gather firewood or carry water in clay jars. These tasks might seem mundane, but they supported the entire system. Without them, no leader could organize a ritual, no artisan could carve stone, and no trader could journey across distant regions. Farming remained central, but it required constant maintenance. Fields had to be rotated, soils replenished, and wild plants integrated into diets during lean seasons. People developed storage techniques to protect surplus grain from pests. They built raised beds in flood-prone areas and dug canals to drain water. During drought years, survival depended on careful planning and cooperation. Households shared resources. Families collectively repaired tools and buildings. Communities held rituals to appeal to natural forces. These rituals might seem symbolic, but they also helped maintain social cohesion during difficult times. One of the most interesting aspects of this era is the movement of ideas. Even without large armies or centralized governments, Olmec influence spread widely. Symbols carved into pottery show up in distant places. Styles of figurines appear far from their origin. Certain motifs, jaguar faces, swirling patterns, human-animal hybrids become part of a shared visual language across Mesoamerica. You can almost feel ideas traveling faster than people, carried along trade routes as objects, stories, and rituals moved from village to village. This is also the period when early ball courts may have begun appearing. Although the most famous ball courts come from later civilizations, the roots of the game likely stretch deep into this era. Imagine a simple open area marked by stones. Two teams, perhaps representing villages or ritual groups, hit a rubber ball using their hips or forearms. The game was not merely entertainment, it symbolized cosmic cycles, social balance, and perhaps even political negotiations. You might stand at the edge of such a space and watch as the rhythm of the ball echoes across the landscape, both playful and deeply symbolic. As Olmec centers grew larger, their needs changed. Workers had to manage water systems, maintain fields, and reinforce platforms. Leaders planned more elaborate rituals tied to seasonal cycles. Craft specialists developed new techniques, such as polishing jade until it shone like water in sunlight. Traders ventured farther. Each year, communities became more interconnected. And yet, despite all this growth, life remained grounded in practical routines. Most people still rose before sunrise, tended fields, prepared meals, and listened to stories passed down through generations. By the time La Venta became a major center, the Olmec world had become something recognizable as a civilization. You would see a central complex with platforms arranged symmetrically, surrounded by smaller dwellings. You might see processions during festivals, people carrying offerings, musicians playing simple instruments, dancers wearing costumes inspired by animals. These were moments when the symbolic world became visible. Yet even then, most days were quiet, shaped by labor rather than spectacle. What makes the Olmec so fascinating is the mystery that still surrounds them. We do not have their written language, if they had one at all. We rely on fragments, objects, architecture, and soil layers. But if you close your eyes and listen closely, you can almost imagine the conversations that once filled these plazas. Arguments about crops, negotiations about trade, instructions for carving stone, stories told to children about jaguars and rain spirits. All of it mundane, meaningful, and deeply human. As night settles over this ancient landscape, you might pause and consider the weight of everything you have seen. A civilization built not on sudden brilliance, but on steady, collective labor. A world connected by ideas rather than armies. A people whose influence shaped countless cultures after them. And it leaves you wondering, how did these early centers grow into cities powerful enough to reshape the entire region? You move now into a landscape where the quiet experiments of earlier generations have begun to reshape the very ground beneath people's feet. The Olmec world, with its plazas and monumental stones, slowly gives way to an era where cities rise with intention, where ceremonial centers grow in size and complexity, and where the mundane rhythms of daily life support some of the most ambitious engineering in ancient history. You are entering the centuries when San Lorenzo, La Venta, and other early centers expanded into places that would influence every civilization that followed. What may surprise you first is how unspectacular these transitions might have seemed to the people living through them. When modern viewers imagine the rise of a great city, they imagine dramatic transformations, sudden bursts of construction, rapid population growth, clear decisions by leaders. But in truth, these places grew the way rivers carve valleys. Slowly, almost invisibly, through thousands of tiny actions carried out without fanfare. You arrive in San Lorenzo during its height. The morning mist clings to the wetlands around you, and the ground beneath your sandals is soft from the previous night's rain. This place sits atop a natural ridge, offering slightly drier ground in a region where seasonal flooding can reshape the landscape in a single afternoon. That strategic choice, settling on higher land, was one of the small, practical decisions that enabled this center to flourish. The builders were not imagining future greatness. They were simply adapting to the land. Yet, as you walk through the settlement, you begin to notice patterns that feel unmistakably urban. Paths worn smooth by constant foot traffic, clusters of homes arranged around courtyards, storage pits lined with clay to keep out water, areas designated for craftsmen, spaces cleared for rituals. It is a city in its earliest stage, born not from grand ambition but from incremental organization. Much of the labor that shaped this place was tedious. Workers dug drainage channels to manage the constant threat of flooding. They carried soil basket by basket to expand elevated platforms. They hauled stones from quarries many miles away, working in teams to move materials that seem impossibly heavy. When you look at a raised platform here, you see an engineered surface, but they saw baskets of dirt, sweat on their arms, sore shoulders, and a schedule dictated by the seasons. One of the most overlooked but significant developments of this period was the emergence of more formalized agricultural systems. Fields had to be maintained not just by families, but by coordinated groups. Irrigation ditches needed seasonal clearing. Canal banks needed repairing. Terraces required careful upkeep. Tasks that once belonged to individual households were now communal responsibilities. This shift, small, practical, almost boring, played a major role in enabling larger populations to thrive. Walking through the early districts of San Lorenzo, you might see women grinding maize on stone metates, a sound that becomes a constant background rhythm. You might see men shaping basalt tools or preparing fishing nets from plant fibers. Children carry baskets of firewood or help chase away birds that threaten crops. These daily activities were not glamorous, yet they were the backbone of everything else. Without them, no leader could commission a new plaza, no craftsman could create a monumental sculpture, and no ritual specialist could plan a ceremony. And speaking of rituals, you would notice that ceremonial spaces here were becoming more defined. Platforms grew taller, boundaries more precise. Certain areas were reserved for gatherings, while others were off-limits, except during specific ceremonies. These distinctions hint at the rise of more complex social roles. There were people who oversaw construction projects, people who managed agricultural planning, people who interpreted celestial movements, and people who mediated disputes. Leadership was still rooted in knowledge and practical skill, but now it was layered, more structured. The art from this period offers a quiet window into daily thoughts and concerns. You might come across small figurines shaped like infants, women, or composite creatures, blending human and animal traits. You might see stone carvings depicting seated individuals wearing elaborate headdresses. You might see swirling motifs that represent rain, wind, or water flow. None of these objects belonged to distant elites. Many were found in ordinary homes, suggesting everyday people participated in rituals and kept symbols that connected them to the larger world. La Venta, which rises to prominence as San Lorenzo gradually declines, feels different. Built on an island-like ridge surrounded by wetlands, it has a more defined ceremonial complex. The centerpiece is a great pyramid-shaped mound made of earth, a structure that required an astonishing amount of labor. You might stand before it and imagine the endless procession of people carrying soil in baskets, layering it carefully, tamping it down to create a stable slope. The process required coordination, trust, and long-term planning. It also required food, lots of it. Feeding workers meant expanding fields, increasing production, and improving storage. This connection between monumental construction and agricultural management is easy to overlook, but it reveals something about how societies evolve. You cannot separate art from farming, or architecture from cooking, or ritual from water management. Every piece depends on the others. Trade networks expanded further during this period. You would see materials from distant regions, obsidian from central highlands, jade from the south, iron ore from faraway mountains. People living here interacted with communities hundreds of miles away, exchanging goods, stories, styles, and rituals. These connections were not accidental. They were the result of sustained effort, repeated journeys, careful negotiations, and mutual dependence. Trade routes were not simple. They crossed mountains, rivers, forests, and marshes. Travelers carried goods on their backs, guided by landmarks, celestial navigation, and knowledge passed down orally. A trader might walk for days, sleep in small villages along the way, share stories at communal fires, and return with materials that shaped local art or tools. You can imagine the quiet pride of someone returning home with a piece of jade, an object so hard that shaping it required grinding for hours with sand and water. Within these growing cities, people developed more sophisticated ways of organizing space. Houses were placed intentionally. Workshops formed clusters. Pathways were maintained. Markets emerged in formal exchanges at first, then more regularized. Markets might not seem dramatic, but they changed how goods moved and how people interacted. They created hubs of information, places where news traveled faster, where innovations spread, where disputes were settled, and where relationships formed. One of the lesser-known but important developments was the refinement of early calendar systems. People here observed the movement of the sun and stars with increasing precision. They recognized the recurrence of certain celestial events and linked them to agricultural cycles. Over time, these observations became formalized into systems that allowed communities to plan rituals, planting, and construction with greater accuracy. The calendar was not merely a tool for timekeeping, it was a framework for organizing society. Architecture also evolved. Builders used clay and sand to create more durable floors. They constructed stone-lined drains. They improved the design of earthen platforms to prevent erosion. They even began experimenting with symmetrical layouts, hinting at concepts of order and cosmology that would later dominate Mesoamerican urban planning. At La Venta, you might witness a ceremony taking place on one of the raised platforms. People gather quietly. A ritual specialist burns resin on a small stone altar. Drums made from hollowed logs and stretched skins provide a steady rhythm. Dancers move in slow, deliberate patterns, offering small jade pieces, carved stone objects. Food are placed carefully into prepared pits. When archaeologists later excavate these pits, they find objects arranged with mathematical precision, revealing a symbolic language that we still only partly understand. But for the people living then, it was not mystery. It was structure. It was how they maintained balance with the world around them. As you walk through this period's cities, you might notice how much effort went into controlling water. Canals, reservoirs, and drainage channels appear in increasing numbers. Water management was essential in a region prone to flooding and drought. These systems required constant maintenance, clearing debris, repairing embankments, reinforcing walls. Workers performed these tasks without ceremony, yet these small acts prevented disaster and allowed communities to grow. And what of conflict? It is easy to imagine ancient societies as peaceful before the rise of large states, but evidence suggests tensions existed even at this stage. Competition for resources, disputes over trade routes, and conflicts between neighboring villages likely shaped political decisions. However, the scale of violence seems smaller compared to later eras. Most conflicts may have been resolved through negotiation, ritual, or alliances. Warfare, when it occurred, was likely brief and localized. By the time you leave this period, Mesoamerica has been transformed. The foundations of urban life are firmly established. Ceremonial centers have grown into influential cities. Trade networks span vast distances. Social roles are more defined, rituals are more structured, calendars are more precise, agriculture sustains larger populations, and architecture reflects a deeper understanding of space and symbolism. You may look over these early cities and wonder how such places grounded in practical labor and modest innovations could give rise to the towering civilizations that followed. But that is the nature of history. Greatness rarely appears suddenly. It emerges from the cumulative weight of ordinary days and ordinary people, which leads you to the next question. How did these steadily growing cities evolve into the vast urban worlds of the classic period, where power, writing, astronomy, and monumental architecture reached new heights? You step forward into the centuries when Mesoamerica transforms again quietly at first, then with a scale so vast you can almost feel the shift in the air. The ground beneath your feet hardens into paved floors. Pathways widen. The patterns of earlier ceremonial centers sharpen into intentional grids. You are entering the classical period, the age when cities like Teotihuacan loom across the landscape, when Maya scribes carve histories into stone, when astronomers map the sky with remarkable precision, and when farmers, builders, traders, and artisans sustain worlds far larger than anything the Olmec planners ever imagined. And as you look around, you realize something important. The rise of these monumental cities was not driven by sudden genius or dramatic rulers, but by a deepening layer of ordinary work, longer harvest seasons, better tools, more sophisticated calendars, and a growing desire to organize life with almost mathematical order. You arrive first in the highlands of central Mexico, where Teotihuacan emerges like a quiet giant. The morning air is crisp and dry, carrying the scent of distant pine forests. Before you lies a city planned with such precision that it feels more like an idea brought into stone than a place where people once woke, cooked breakfast, and argued over market prices. Yet that is exactly what it was, a living city of ordinary people. What surprises most visitors, and maybe surprises you now, is that Teotihuacan did not develop all at once. It began as a cluster of small villages. Slowly, almost unnoticed, families moved closer together. Farmers improved their fields. Craftsmen produced more goods. Trade routes expanded. leaders coordinated construction, and over generations, these small changes accumulated into a city that eventually housed tens of thousands of people. You walk along the wide central avenue, later known as the Avenue of the Dead. The stones under your feet are smooth, worn by thousands of footsteps. To your left, the Pyramid of the Sun rises, with a mass so massive that you can almost hear the endless rhythm of baskets being filled, lifted, and emptied during its construction. Do not imagine armies of slaves. Imagine instead coordinated labor from many districts, each contributing work during festival seasons, each bringing food, tools, and stories to the building site. The project was less about power and more about communal identity, tied to rituals that marked agricultural cycles and celestial events. Teotihuacan's architecture reflects ideas shared across the city. Buildings align with astronomical markers, not just for drama, but for scheduling, planting, predicting seasons, and organizing rituals. This relationship between architecture and timekeeping is a theme that echoes across the entire classical period. The sky was not a distant mystery. It was a calendar, a clock, a map. Ordinary people understood it deeply because their survival depended on it. But to fully appreciate this era, you must also drift south and east into the forests, limestone plains, and mountains where Maya city-states rise and fall with intricate rhythms. Here, the world feels different. The air is heavier, filled with humidity, and the sound of insects hidden in foliage. You walk through a Maya city such as Tikal or Copan and notice how different the atmosphere feels compared to Teotihuacan's vast highland openness. Maya cities weave into the landscape rather than imposing upon it. Trees rise between buildings, narrow causeways cut through dense vegetation, reservoirs shimmer in the heat. Every structure, from the tall pyramids to the smallest homes, exists in conversation with the environment around it. What sets the Maya world apart is not merely its architecture, but its obsession with recording time. You see stone monuments carved with dates. You see walls marked with astronomical observations. You see stelae describing rulers, wars, marriages, and rituals in a writing system developed with complexity unmatched in the region. And yet, for all the splendor of kings and rulers recorded in glyphs, the backbone of these cities remains the same: farmers, artisans, builders, weavers, and scribes whose lives were filled with tasks that demanded patience more than glory. Imagine a Maya scribe sitting cross-legged on a woven mat, carving glyphs into a soft stone surface. Each stroke must be deliberate. A single chip in the wrong place changes the meaning. He learned this skill over many years, memorizing signs, practicing on clay, copying older texts. His work is not a dramatic performance, but a slow, careful craft that preserves history, astronomy, myth, and political events. Without him, the stories of entire dynasties would vanish. And what about the farmers? They cultivated maize on terraced hillsides, drained swamps to create raised fields, and rotated crops to preserve soil fertility. Their work was repetitive, sometimes harsh, but without it, the monumental structures around you would crumble from neglect, because cities cannot exist without steady food supplies. In many cases, farmers traveled from miles away to markets, carrying baskets of produce across uneven paths. Their daily journeys connected households to the political centers, even if they never spoke with rulers directly. Craft specialization deepened during the classical period. Potters perfected slips and polished surfaces until their vessels gleamed. Stoneworkers carved masks with almost lifelike contours. Weavers produced textiles dyed with pigments from insects and plants. Obsidian knappers mastered fracture patterns so precise that blades from Teotihuacan could be exported hundreds of miles away. These craftspeople rarely appear in monumental inscriptions, yet their work shaped economic networks throughout Mesoamerica. Trade itself expanded dramatically. Goods moved in complex webs: obsidian, salt, cacao, feathers, shells, jade, cotton, pigments, ceramics. You might picture a trader walking along a causeway that connects two Maya cities. He carries a pack filled with cacao beans, so valuable they doubled as currency. He will exchange these beans for pottery made in another region, then carry news and stories back home. Along the way, he stops in smaller villages, drinks water at communal wells, listens to local disputes, and exchanges goods in markets bustling with voices, children, and animals. Meanwhile, in Teotihuacan, apartment compounds reveal a different form of urban life. Instead of scattered households or open plazas, you find walled residential complexes, housing extended families or occupational groups. These apartments include workshops, shared kitchens, storage areas, and courtyards. Daily life here revolves around routines: sweeping floors, grinding grain, repairing tools, preparing meals, storing rainwater, and participating in neighborhood rituals. It is not the glamorous life of rulers. It is the ordinary urban existence that allowed the city to function. Not all developments of this era were peaceful. The classical period saw conflicts between Maya city-states, shifting alliances, and occasional upheavals. Inscriptions record wars, captures of rivals, and rituals celebrating victories. But even during conflicts, most people continued their routines, tending fields, maintaining canals, repairing homes, because war was not the center of their lives. It was an event at the edges, shaped by the ambitions of leaders but sustained by the resilience of everyday households. Astronomy became increasingly sophisticated. Maya observers watched the movements of Venus with extraordinary precision. They tracked lunar cycles and predicted eclipses. They built observatories aligned with key celestial events. These observations were not purely scientific. They guided rituals, agricultural planning, and political decisions. Imagine a priest climbing a tall pyramid before dawn, watching Venus rise, and calculating the appropriate time for planting or the date of an upcoming ceremony. The calculations may seem abstract to us, but they were grounded in practical needs. Water management was another crucial, often overlooked element of classical-era life. Cities built reservoirs, canals, and filtration systems. In dry regions, people collected rainwater in plaster-lined cisterns. In wetter areas, they drained swamps and constructed raised fields. These systems required constant maintenance, clearing sediment, repairing walls, reinforcing embankments. Year after year, generation after generation, workers performed these tasks without ceremony. Yet these mundane acts allowed cities to endure even during droughts that might otherwise have caused collapse. As you move between regions, you notice the diversity of architectural styles. Teotihuacan features talud tablero facades, slanted walls, supporting vertical panels. Maya cities rise in stepped pyramids with steep stairways. In the Oaxaca Valley, Monte Alban spreads across a flattened mountain summit. Each center developed unique solutions to similar challenges: organizing space, hosting rituals, managing water, and supporting populations. And yet, despite all this diversity, you sense a shared thread running through the classical period: an expanding awareness of how communities fit into larger cosmic cycles. People built structures aligned with solstices. They carved symbols representing the world's four directions. They recorded time on scales spanning thousands of years. These acts were not dramatic revolutions, they were accumulations of observations, traditions, and lessons passed down quietly. By the later centuries of the classical period, some cities begin to show signs of strain. Environmental pressures, internal conflicts, shifts in trade routes, and changing political dynamics all play roles. Teotihuacan eventually declines. Some Maya cities experience upheaval. Yet even in decline, people adapt, populations move, new centers rise, ideas persist. As dusk settles over the landscapes of this era, you look at the vastness of what has been built: the pyramids, the plazas, the reservoirs, the roads, and you realize that none of it would exist without the daily routines of countless individuals whose names we will never know. Their quiet resilience shapes everything you see. And now, as you prepare to step into the next era of this long story, one question lingers in the cooling air. When these great classical cities began to fade, what forces, silent, gradual, and deeply human, brought about their decline and reshaped the entire region once again? Night settles over the classical world, not as a sudden darkness, but as a slow dimming, lantern by lantern, hearth by hearth, generation by generation. You stand at the threshold of a long twilight, where the great cities that once pulsed with life begin to quiet. Their plazas no longer echo with the same energy. Their rulers carve fewer monuments, their farmers look anxiously toward the sky, hoping for steadier rains. You are entering the era historians often call the late classical, or the beginnings of the so-called Mesoamerican collapse, though collapse is too dramatic a word for what really happened. Nothing toppled overnight. Nothing burned all at once. Instead, the story unfolds through small shifts, accumulating pressures, and countless choices made by ordinary families trying to survive unpredictable times. The first thing you notice is the weather. For generations, the skies had followed stable rhythms. Wet seasons brought life, dry seasons brought manageable hardship. But now, something changes. The rains become irregular. Some years, storms arrive early and flood the fields. Other years, the skies stay stubbornly clear, leaving maize to wither. You can picture a farmer standing in his field, scanning the horizon. His father taught him that the clouds would gather by a certain point in the calendar. His grandfather believed the same, and yet, here he stands, hands resting on his hips, wondering why the soil turns powdery under his feet. He is not alone. Drought patterns ripple across regions, sometimes for a season, sometimes for a generation. Not everywhere, not all at once, but enough to stress the systems that made big cities possible. Reservoirs require more maintenance. Canals silt up. Terraces erode. Every repair takes time, labor, and cooperation. And some communities start to fracture under the strain. But climate is only one thread in this unraveling tapestry. Politics begins to shift too. In Maya lowland cities, royal courts become increasingly competitive. Rulers demand more monuments, more rituals, more validation of their power. Stelae grow crowded with records of alliances, marriages, victories, and captures. Behind the carved drama, you sense rising tension. A king who once governed through prestige now feels compelled to prove himself constantly. A neighboring ruler watches with suspicion. A marriage alliance frays under pressure. Envoys grow wary. The delicate dance between city-states becomes more volatile. Conflict becomes more common, not necessarily massive wars, but a steady hum of raids, skirmishes, and posturing that disrupts trade routes and destabilizes rural communities. Picture a trader walking the same familiar path he has walked his whole life, only to find the causeway blocked by soldiers demanding tribute. Or imagine a village hearing rumors of unrest in a nearby city and choosing to relocate rather than risk entanglement in noble disputes. These decisions, though small individually, accumulate into a larger transformation. Meanwhile, in Teotihuacan, something else stirs. The great city, once defined by its monumental calm, begins to show fractures within its own structure. Neighborhoods that had cooperated for centuries now show signs of independence. Some compounds assert more local control. Others suffer shortages. Perhaps a drought stresses supply networks. Perhaps political factions form around competing visions for the city's future. You walk through one district and see homes that look slightly neglected, plaster flaking, tools unrepaired. In another district, workshops work frantically, as though scrambling to meet new pressures. The city still stands, but it no longer feels unified. Eventually, some parts of Teotihuacan burn. Archaeologists still debate the cause. Was it an internal uprising, a shift in leadership, a breakdown in political authority? Whatever the reason, the fires do not sweep the whole city. Instead, they mark symbolic targets, government buildings, elite residences. The message is clear. The old system is ending. And yet, even as centers like Teotihuacan decline, the story is not one of universal collapse. It is one of change, redistribution, adaptation. You walk away from the great highland city and find new settlements springing up in its shadow. Smaller, more flexible communities take root. Farmers adjust their planting strategies. Traders redirect their routes. Craftsmen carry their skills elsewhere. Life continues not with the grandeur of earlier centuries, but with an enduring practicality. In the Maya world, the pattern is similar, though stretched across a longer span. Some cities falter early, others flourish far into the later centuries. Some lose population gradually, others are abandoned more suddenly. But even in these places, daily routines persist far longer than the monumental silence suggests. You can imagine a family sweeping their courtyard decades after the last king's stela was raised, still grinding maize, still tending gardens, still teaching children the proper way to lay out offerings. What shifts most dramatically is the balance between rural and urban life. As large centers weaken, many families choose to leave. The countryside begins to repopulate. Small villages gain autonomy. Instead of relying on distant capitals, households rely more heavily on local networks, shared wells, shared fields, shared defenses. This decentralization is not a collapse, but a reorganization of society. As populations redistribute, new ideas travel more freely. In the highlands of Oaxaca, Zapotec communities adapt by forming tighter regional alliances. They maintain some traditions while incorporating new influences. In western Mexico, emerging cultures experiment with metallurgy, one of the quiet technological shifts of the period. Copper bells, tools, and ornaments appear, small at first, but significant in their implications. You can almost hear the first metallic chime echoing across a marketplace, a sound unheard in earlier centuries. And while all of this takes place, the region just to the north begins developing something new, something that will profoundly reshape the next era. A city rises in the basin of Mexico, smaller at first than Teotihuacan, but unusually well organized. Families build their homes according to a planned layout. Markets thrive. Canals crisscross urban districts. Agricultural terraces climb hillsides with geometric precision. This city is Tula, and though its height comes later, you already sense the foundations being laid here during the post-Teotihuacan generations. Artisans in the region refine new styles. Sculptures become more angular, more stylized, with warrior imagery growing increasingly prominent. Trade networks reconnect, now orbiting different centers. The cultural landscape shifts like a constellation reorganizing itself, with old stars fading and new ones beginning to glow. Across Mesoamerica, communities innovate in subtle, practical ways. Farmers adopt mixed cropping strategies to hedge against unpredictable rains. Builders experiment with new materials. Local leaders rise, who are less like kings and more like coordinators of communal needs. Ritual practices simplify in some regions and intensify in others. Diversity increases as centralizing forces weaken. And through all of this, one theme remains constant: resilience. It is easy to imagine the decline of great cities as a tragedy, but to the people living through it, life was not a narrative of loss, it was a puzzle of survival. You see a woman storing extra maize in a pit lined with pottery shards to keep rodents out. You see a fisherman teaching his son to read subtle changes in river currents. You see a potter adjusting the firing temperature in her kiln to conserve scarce fuel. You see a midwife telling stories of ancestors to reassure a child frightened by rumors of unrest. These quiet scenes form the real history of the era. By the time the 9th and 10th centuries unfold, much of the classical order has faded. Teotihuacan stands as a hulking memory. Many Maya cities are shadows of their former grandeur. But the people, farmers, weavers, hunters, merchants, healers, remain. They reshape the world to fit new conditions. They create new alliances, new settlements, new cultural patterns, and out of this vast reorganization emerges a foundation upon which later powers will build. Because soon, in the Central Highlands, the Toltec world will rise. And after that, much later, a small group of migrants, calling themselves the Mexica, will arrive. They will look upon the ruins of Teotihuacan and see not the remnants of a complicated, gradually changing city, but the traces of gods walking the earth. They will build myths from the stones. They will inherit cultural threads preserved through countless generations during this so-called collapse. But for now, here, in this moment, you stand in the soft, uncertain dawn after the classical twilight. Communities are scattered but alive. Fields are tended with cautious optimism. Old stories survive in whispered form. And as you walk through this transformed landscape, you sense that a new era is taking shape, woven from the endurance of ordinary people who refuse to disappear. You step into a world rebuilding itself. The classical order has faded, leaving behind wide spaces where new voices rise and old traditions shift. This period, often called the post-classic, does not open with fanfare or the dramatic sweep of empire. Instead, it begins with the slow, steady work of ordinary people, creating new patterns of life from the fragments left behind. You stand among them, not as a ruler or a warrior, but as an observer, wandering across landscapes where resilience matters more than grandeur. The first thing you notice is movement. Families pack their belongings, woven mats, clay vessels, bundles of maize, and travel across valleys in small groups. Some move because their old cities no longer offer security. Others seek better farmlands, more reliable water sources, or communities less entangled in the political tensions of the preceding centuries. You walk beside them along dusty roads carved by generations of footsteps, listening to their practical conversations. They speak not of kings or temples, but of rain, neighbors, storage pits, and the best way to keep insects away from grain. This is a time defined by migration, but not dramatic mass migrations. Instead, countless small decisions accumulate across generations. Entire regions slowly reorganize themselves, often guided by the most basic need of all: survival. Among these shifting communities rises Tula. You come upon the city gradually, its outlines sharpening as you approach. It is not as enormous as the old giant Teotihuacan, but it is better structured, more disciplined. The houses form neat neighborhoods. Streets follow deliberate lines. Public buildings rise from carefully planned plazas. You sense an emphasis on order, on coordination, on shared purpose. Even the soundscape feels different, less like the echoing vastness of the classical world, and more like a steady hum of activity. Inside workshops, artisans shape obsidian blades with practiced hands, drawing long, whispering curls from the stone. Others cast copper bells that ring softly when lifted. Metallurgy, once rare in Mesoamerica, spreads during this time. These early tools and ornaments are simple, almost modest, but they symbolize a remarkable shift. People are experimenting again, trying new techniques, stretching beyond inherited traditions. Trade routes reconnect as well. Merchants walk in lines along causeways, carrying salt, cotton, cacao, medicines, pottery, dried fish, feathers, tools, and carved bone. Some carry copper ornaments recently produced in western Mexico. Others bring seashells from distant coasts. You walk among them and hear stories about weather patterns, river levels, which towns offer fair prices, and which settlements demand excessive tribute. Instead of the old imperial systems that dominated wide regions, the post-classic world thrives on flexible networks, less centralized, more dependent on personal agreements, and often surprisingly stable. If you follow the trade routes south and east, you arrive in the Maya regions that survived the late classical reorganization. These cities are smaller than their classical predecessors, but they endure with renewed practicality. Their plazas may no longer hold towering pyramids built for ambitious kings, yet they teem with life. Markets trading everyday goods, families tending gardens, scribes recording simple but vital local affairs. You walk through them and sense a quiet determination, as though the communities have learned from the turbulences of previous centuries that stability, however modest, is more valuable than monumental display. The Maya who persist into this era develop a rich intellectual world. Astronomers still track the movements of Venus. Scribes still write histories, though often on smaller, more portable media. Farmers maintain terraces, reservoirs, and canals with careful attention. Their survival strategies rely not on dramatic innovations, but on the disciplined maintenance of land and community. You watch a group of villagers rebuild a water channel stone by stone, adjusting each slab until the flow is just right. Their work is slow, almost tedious, but essential. Traveling north again, you see how the influences of Tula spread. Carved warrior figures appear in distant cities. Feathered serpents wind across new temples. Architectural styles echo Toltec forms, though each region adapts them differently. Some scholars debate whether this influence reflects conquest or prestige. But walking along these roads, talking with ordinary people, you realize influence often flows through admiration rather than force. Traders bring stories of Tula's orderliness. Artisans copy designs not because they are commanded, but because they admire the balance and symmetry. Leaders model their households on ways they perceive as sophisticated. Culture spreads through quiet imitation more than aggressive expansion. As the centuries pass, new confederations arise. In the highlands of Oaxaca, Zapotec communities forge alliances based on mutual support rather than centralized rule. In the Gulf Coast, smaller polities develop strong identities through trade specialization. In Yucatan, new Maya cities like Mayapan embrace tighter, more defensible layouts, practical responses to the uncertainties of the age. Everywhere you travel, you see groups refining agriculture, improving irrigation, exploring new crafts, and strengthening local networks. And yet, survival is not effortless. Droughts still come. Conflicts spark between neighboring communities. Some leaders overreach. Some settlements fail. But the world no longer depends on a few colossal centers whose instability can shake entire regions. Instead, the post-classic landscape resembles a mosaic clusters of communities capable of adapting, relocating, or reorganizing without tearing the entire cultural fabric. The emotional tone of this world is different too. Gone is the towering ambition of the classical dynasties. In its place, you feel a grounded clarity. People carve simpler monuments, not to glorify divine rulers but to record agreements, renew alliances, or mark communal spaces. Rituals continue, but many are conducted on a household or neighborhood scale. You witness families making offerings of maize, copal, and water at small shrines built at the edges of their fields, rituals tied closely to everyday survival rather than grand cosmic narratives. In Tula itself, life pulses with the energy of craftsmen, traders, and soldiers. The city's disciplined structure shapes its character. Warriors train in large open courtyards, practicing with obsidian-tipped spears under the observation of elders. Young apprentices learn stone carving from master sculptors. Merchants plan long expeditions, charting routes with careful attention to seasonal changes. You can almost feel the city preparing itself consciously or not for the cultural legacy it will leave. But Tula, like those before it, will eventually falter. Internal tensions rise, external pressures grow, climate challenges reappear. By the late centuries of the first millennium, the great Toltec city begins to contract. Some districts empty, others maintain life for decades before slowly quieting. It is not a dramatic collapse, it is a gradual release, a long exhale, a return of land to silence. What remains after Tula's decline is not an empty landscape, but one filled with communities accustomed to adapting. The knowledge forged during these centuries, the flexible trade networks, the use of copper tools, the regional alliances, the emphasis on practical survival, will shape the next great transformation of Mesoamerica, because soon, new arrivals will come to the basin of Mexico. A group of migrants, carrying little but determination and memory, will settle near the lake shores. They will be called the Mexica. They will build upon the lessons of cities long gone. They will inherit not only the visible ruins, but also the invisible knowledge stored in markets, households, and migration patterns. For now, though, you stand in a world quietly reshaped by countless ordinary decisions. A world that has learned to bend without breaking. A world where survival depends not on grand temples, but on shared labor, shared water, and shared hope. And as evening settles over the post-classic landscape, you might ask yourself, how many of the most important changes in history happen not through dramatic moments, but through these patient, almost invisible acts of endurance? You arrive in the basin of Mexico at a moment when the land feels like it is quietly preparing itself. The great Toltec center of Tula has faded into memory, leaving behind fragments of architecture, lingering styles, and stories spoken more in admiration than certainty. Around the lakes, small city-states manage their affairs with steady, practical rhythms. Canals glisten in the morning light. Chinampa fields stretch like floating gardens toward the horizon. Fishermen glide in canoes made smooth from years of patient carving. Life is organized, cooperative, and deeply rooted. But into this world steps a group of newcomers, outsiders with no grand city behind them, no extensive trade network, no richly carved lineage. They call themselves the Mexica, and you find them first not as rulers but as migrants searching for a place to survive. Their beginnings are far less dramatic than legend suggests. You see them walking along dusty trails in small clusters, carrying bundles wrapped in woven cloth, guiding children, helping elders, and quietly discussing where they might settle. They are not yet fierce warriors or architects of empire. They are families attempting to find a foothold in a landscape already shaped by others. The established city-states look at them with a mix of suspicion and opportunity. Suspicious because newcomers can disrupt delicate political balances, and opportunistic because migrants can be put to work. The Mexica accept whatever labor is offered. You watch them dig canals, carry stones for building projects, harvest reeds along the lakeshore, and tend fields not their own. Some serve as mercenaries in local conflicts, offering their skill with weapons in exchange for temporary safety. Their stories during these early years are not tales of conquest but of endurance. Every settlement that allows them entry eventually pushes them out again, wary of their growing numbers and their fierce pride. Eventually, they make their way to the marshy island regions of Lake Texcoco land, considered undesirable by many, but for the Mexica, it is an opportunity wrapped in mud and reeds. You walk with them across patches of soft ground where your feet sink slightly. They see, not useless wetlands, but spaces that can be reclaimed with labor. They begin weaving mud, reeds, and stakes into foundations, early versions of the Chinampa expansions that will later make their city flourish. This is where their story shifts, because once the Mexica secure a place where others do not contest them, their ingenuity emerges. They build slowly at first, raised platforms for homes, simple temples, modest canals, but each structure is engineered with remarkable care. Every stone is placed with long-term purpose. Every canal is dug to control water flow for generations. You realize that their greatest strength is not warfare, it is organization, discipline, and the ability to turn adversity into structure. Still, survival remains difficult. Food is scarce, water quality varies, the wetland soil demands constant maintenance. Families work from sunrise to sundown, shaping agricultural plots and reinforcing canal walls. Their leaders focus not on monumental architecture, but on making sure that every household has enough maize stored to weather thin seasons. These early decades are formative, creating the cultural backbone that will define the future empire. Communal work, unwavering belief in collective identity, and an understanding that hardship can forge strength. But political realities soon draw them into larger alliances. The Basin of Mexico is full of ultipetal city-states, with their own rulers, markets, alliances, and rivalries. None of them ignore the growing presence of the Mexica for long. You observe emissaries arriving in canoes, their garments marking them as representatives of cities like Culhuacan or Texcoco. They speak with measured tones, offering agreements or issuing warnings. The Mexica respond with careful diplomacy, knowing that one misstep could lead to removal or destruction. For a time, they serve under the authority of Culhuacan. They adopt local customs, marry into noble lines, and participate in regional ceremonies. But tension always simmer beneath the surface. The Mexica are valuable allies, but also unpredictable ones. Eventually, conflict erupts, pushing them once again into uncertainty. You watch families relocate yet again, paddling canoes filled with belongings toward another stretch of difficult terrain. Their final settlement, the one that will become Tenochtitlan, emerges not from triumph but from necessity. The island is small and not especially hospitable. The winds sweep across the lake with relentless chill. Mosquitoes hum in dense clouds, but the Mexica now understand how to make land from water, how to create soil from sediment, how to carve a city from nothing. They fortify the island, build causeways, plant chinampas, and craft a defensive landscape that few rivals can match. With each passing year, their confidence grows. The rise of the Mexica is not sudden. It is the result of thousands of tiny adjustments, each household refining its techniques, each leader negotiating carefully, each generation inheriting a stronger foundation. You see young warriors training with discipline unheard of in earlier decades. You see priests performing rituals that bind communities together through shared cosmology. You see merchants traveling farther, mapping trade routes with purposeful curiosity. Then comes the turning point, the formation of the Triple Alliance. You witness representatives from Tenochtitlan, Texcoco, and Tlacopan meeting in solemn ceremony. Their agreement is not merely political, it is deeply practical. Together, they combine military strength, economic networks, and strategic positions across the lake system. You stand at the edge of the meeting platform as they lay out their intentions: shared tribute, coordinated warfare, mutual defense, and a systematic expansion that benefits all three powers. Yet behind the formal agreements lies the quiet labor of ordinary people, the farmers who expand Chinampa fields inch by inch, the builders who reinforce causeways, the artisans who craft tribute goods, and the traders who link the alliance to distant regions. Without them, no empire would take shape. The Mexica transform from outsiders to central actors. Their markets grow vibrant. Their political structure becomes sharper and more defined. Their military strategy evolves into a disciplined system based on alliances, intimidation, and calculated displays of strength. But beneath the surface of their rising power, a question lingers. Is an empire built on fragile wetlands, on relentless labor, and on the momentum of alliances destined to expand forever? Or is its strength tied to the same forces, environment, politics, trade, that shaped and dissolved the civilizations before it? As you stand on the shores of the growing island city and watch another canoe glide in loaded with woven mats, obsidian tools, and baskets of maize, you sense both the promise and the tension. The Mexica are rising, but where that rise ultimately leads remains uncertain. You enter Tenochtitlan at dawn. When the air is cool, the lake reflects pale bands of light, and the city feels as though it is breathing in slowly. The causeways stretch toward the island, like quiet pathways of intention, straight and sturdy, built from layer upon layer of stone and timber, placed by hands that understood the patience required to create permanence on water. As you walk across, you notice how the lake shifts its colors gray in some places, nearly silver in others, and how canoes glide beneath you with a gentle rhythm that seems older than the city itself. When you first step onto the island, the sensory detail is overwhelming. You expect noise, but what you find is structure. The streets follow an organized grid. The canals run in tidy lines, turning the surface of the city into a kind of checkerboard of land and water. Bridges arc calmly over the waterways, and everywhere you look, someone is working on something. A fisherman mends a net. A potter smooths the rim of a vessel. A child carries a basket of maize from a chinampa. The city hums, not with chaos, but with an extraordinary discipline. This is the daily life of one of the most remarkable urban centers of the ancient world, not because of its size, though it is vast, and not because of its monuments, though they are many, but because of its astonishing practicality. Tenochtitlan thrives through the meticulous effort of ordinary people whose routines, though repetitive, shape the empire's backbone. You begin at the markets. The great marketplace at Tlatelolco sits just north of the main ceremonial precinct. As you enter, the space unfolds in orderly rows, marked by categories. Pottery here, foodstuffs there, textiles farther in, medicines to the side, tools along a separate lane. Vendors sit behind woven mats, displaying everything from obsidian blades to dried herbs, from cacao beans to baskets of small amphibians used for their medicinal qualities. You hear the soft murmur of trading, not the aggressive bargaining of other ancient markets, but a calm, almost procedural rhythm of exchange. Buyers carry small, standardized loads of goods, often measured in cotton cloths, cacao beans, or carefully weighed parcels of salt. You observe how strictly the trading rules are enforced. Officials circulate through the crowd, ensuring fair measurements and resolving disputes. Punishments for fraud are serious, creating a sense of trust that allows even distant merchants to trade with confidence. This market alone feeds an economic network that stretches hundreds of miles beyond the basin, linking highland and lowland, desert and forest. The air is filled with scents you can almost pinpoint: roasted maize, crushed herbs, drying fish, damp reeds, and the subtle smokiness of pottery pits. People move with purpose, each task part of the larger, invisible mechanism that sustains the city. From the marketplace, you wander toward the chinampas, the floating gardens that make this city possible. On the lake's surface, shallow rectangles of land emerge in neat patterns, each framed by stakes woven with branches, each filled with sediment and enriched with organic matter. Farmers tend them carefully, planting maize, beans, squash, chilies, flowers, and medicinal plants in a rotating cycle that keeps the soil productive year after year. You see a farmer kneeling at the edge of his plot, scooping water with a gourd to moisten a row of seedlings. His motions are slow, practiced, steady. Across from him, a young girl carries a bundle of reeds used to reinforce the edges of the platform. The beauty of the Chinampa system lies not in dramatic innovation, but in the persistence of maintenance. Every day, farmers remove invasive plants, repair the edges, and dredge sediment from the lake floor. Over time, these small actions transform unstable wetlands into productive farmland, ensuring that the city remains fed even as its population grows. Without these countless repetitive tasks, the empire's might would crumble. You continue toward the ceremonial center. The great temple rises from the heart of the city, its twin stairways climbing toward shrines dedicated to two deities. Yet, despite its imposing presence, what catches your attention is not its height, but its constant state of renewal. Workers carry fresh plaster, sweep debris from steps, and chip stone to replace weathered carvings. Even in sacred spaces, maintenance takes precedence. Nothing in Tenochtitlan is left to decay unattended. Surrounding the temple are schools, karmakaks, and Telpok Kalis, where young people study histories, rituals, warfare, and practical skills. From one building, you hear students chanting memorized lines of instruction. From another, the soft thud of training weapons hitting wooden posts. Education here emphasizes both discipline and purpose. Each child, whether from a noble family or a common household, learns not only how to fight or farm, but how to contribute to the greater structure of the city. You walk through neighborhoods where homes cluster around small courtyards. Most houses are modest single-story structures made of adobe or stone, with reed mats on floors and simple hearths for cooking. Women grind maize on metates, their rhythmic motions steady and patient. Men weave fishing nets, carve tools, or prepare materials for building projects. Children help with small tasks, carrying firewood or sorting beans. These ordinary routines sustain the empire far more than any ceremony. What strikes you most is how little waste the city produces. Everything has a use. Broken pottery becomes fill for construction. Organic matter becomes fertilizer for the Chinampas. Reeds from the lake become mats, baskets, roofing, or insulation. Even obsidian flakes from toolmaking find purpose in smaller household items. This careful efficiency allows Tenochtitlan to thrive on limited land with surprising sustainability. As you continue your walk, you notice the political machinery operating with quiet precision. Local leaders manage neighborhoods, enforcing rules and organizing labor. Tax collectors move through districts with measured steps, recording tribute obligations in bundles of knotted cords or painted manuscripts. Messengers run along causeways delivering reports to the central authority. Every person plays a role in maintaining the urban web. In the evenings, the city transforms. The lake reflects torchlight. Canoes glide like shadows across the water. People gather in courtyards to share meals of maize tortillas, beans, vegetables, and freshwater fish. They speak of weather changes, trade prospects, children's progress in school, and small domestic concerns. The empire may project an image of relentless power, but the heart of Tenochtitlan beats with conversations like these quiet, ordinary, deeply human. Yet, for all its strengths, the city exists in a delicate balance. It depends on stable lake levels, predictable harvests, and the cooperation of tributary states. The alliance structure requires constant negotiation. A drought could strain food supplies. A rebellion in a distant region could disrupt trade. A shift in leadership could alter the city's direction. You sense, even in this moment of flourishing, how finely tuned the entire system must remain to function. And as you watch a line of canoes returning from distant territories with tribute bundles stacked neatly in the hulls, you cannot help but wonder how much pressure an empire built on such intricate foundations can endure. For now, though, Tenochtitlan stands at its height, disciplined, efficient, and alive, with 1,000 quiet actions performed every hour by people whose names are lost to history, but whose labor shaped a world. You stand at the edge of the causeway on a warm, windless morning when the first rumors reach Tenochtitlan. They drift in like distant echoes. Strangers on the coast, beings in shimmering metal, animals taller than any deer, weapons that roar like thunder. At first, the stories feel exaggerated, the sort of tales merchants bring back from long travels, half truth, half flourish. But the city listens. It has to. News, even uncertain news, is as vital here as maize or water. You walk through the marketplace at Tlatelolco, and the energy has shifted. Vendors still lay out their woven mats, still arrange their pottery, beans, feathers, and obsidian blades, but they lean inward more often now, whispering to one another. You pass a stall selling medicinal herbs and overhear a woman telling a customer that the strangers have pale skin, like lime plaster, and wear coverings that shine in the sun. She gestures with a mix of fear and fascination. Across the lake, runners arrive breathless from the coastal towns. Their messages are wrapped tightly in cloth and handed over to officials who disappear into the administrative buildings near the ceremonial center. At every level, neighborhood councils, warrior schools, noble households, people are asking the same questions. Who are these newcomers? What do they want? Why now? The truth is that first contact is never a simple collision. It is a long, confusing process made up of misunderstandings, negotiations, quiet observations, political calculations, and the daily lives of people who are trying to make sense of something unprecedented. And so, you begin to follow the stories as they ripple inward. From the eastern shores come reports of a leader Cortez, whose intentions are unclear. He arrives with steel weapons that can cut through obsidian, horses that move with unsettling power, and animals that bark loudly at night. Some coastal towns send offerings, unsure whether the newcomers are humans, messengers from distant islands, or even supernatural beings. Other towns want nothing to do with them. Meanwhile, emissaries from the Mexica leadership travel outward, bearing gifts to assess these strangers. They bring fine cloaks, food, jewelry, and requests for information. When they return, their accounts are vivid. The armor glints like water in the sun, the bearded faces seem unlike any known people, and the weapons produce smoke and noise that frightens even seasoned warriors. Yet woven into these extraordinary details are quieter observations. The strangers grow tired, their animals need food, their metal corrodes in the humidity, their feet blister on long marches. They bleed when injured. They fear unfamiliar terrain. These are not gods. They are simply people from somewhere else dangerous, yes, but human. You walk deeper into the city, where the ceremonial precinct rises above the busy streets. The great temple casts long shadows as leaders debate what the newcomer's arrival means. Messengers move with urgent steps. Priests read omens in the sky and in the patterns of fire. Some see signs of potential catastrophe, others call for diplomacy. This tension reaches even the smallest homes. In a quiet neighborhood, a family shares a meal of maize and beans while discussing the latest reports. The mother says the newcomers are likely seeking alliances. The father believes they want tribute. The eldest child, who trains at the Karmakak, wonders if these strangers have come because they are fleeing turmoil in their own lands. No one agrees, but everyone feels the tremor of uncertainty. Then there are the alliances, one of the most overlooked aspects of this era. As Cortes moves inland, he encounters towns long resentful of Mexican dominance. Tlaxcala, a powerful confederation in its own right, becomes a crucial partner. But this alliance is not inevitable. It is a messy, hesitant decision shaped by local politics, old grievances, the need for survival, and the calculations of leaders who are weighing two risks: the familiar threat of Mexican power or the unfamiliar danger of the newcomers. When you follow the trail of these alliances, you meet people who have never been mentioned in any textbook. A scout who guides the newcomers across a ravine he has walked since childhood. A translator who knows just enough Nahuatl to catch meanings that others miss. A woman in a small town who urges her leaders to delay an alliance until they understand the strangers better. None of these individuals are remembered by name, but their actions shift the course of events. Communication becomes the heart of the encounter. You listen as interpreters attempt to bridge languages through gestures, borrowed words, misunderstandings, and constant improvisation. When a newcomer points to the sky, does he mean weather, gods, or distance? When a Mexican emissary bows slightly, is it deference, caution, or simply respect? Every moment of contact is a negotiation. And within the city, Life continues in ways that seem almost contradictory to the looming tension. Farmers still tend the chinampas, pulling weeds and dredging lake sediment with practiced hands. Children still run along the canal paths, their laughter echoing across the water. Fishermen still set their nets at dawn. Craftsmen still sharpen obsidian blades in small courtyards. The city's routines do not pause, because survival depends on constancy. As the newcomers draw closer to the capital, more messengers arrive. Some describe small battles in which the strangers fight alongside their indigenous allies. Others report unexpected diplomacy, gifts exchanged, meals shared, agreements negotiated. You see the confusion in the eyes of people who hear these reports. The newcomers are both peaceful and violent, both respectful and demanding, both unpredictable and strangely strategic. When you return to the marketplace in the evening, the setting sun bathes the city in warm, coppery light. Vendors are packing up their goods. A group of elders stands near the canal discussing the stories they heard that day. One claims that the strangers bring diseases unseen before, illnesses that can spread like fire among the unprepared. Another insists that such tales are exaggerated. A teenage boy nearby listens silently, trying to imagine a world where sickness arrives simply because a new group of people has crossed the sea. In the calm between daylight and darkness, you sense the weight of uncertainty settling over the city. People do not yet know that these first encounters will lead to siege, collapse, and unimaginable loss. They only know that something unprecedented is happening, and they are trying to understand it as best they can. And as the last boats of the evening cross the lake, their silhouettes reflected in the still water, you realize that first contact is not a single event, nor a sudden disaster. It is a gradual unraveling, a slow shift in perception, a series of moments in which ordinary people, farmers, traders, children, leaders, attempt to navigate a future they can neither predict nor control. You stand at the edge of a city that once felt invincible. The lake still glitters in the morning light, the chinampas still sway in gentle rows, and the causeways stretch outward like the arms of a resting giant. But something in the air has shifted. It is quieter now, too quiet. The birds still call, the wind still moves across the water, but the hum of daily life has thinned into something fragile. You begin to walk the streets of Tenochtitlan in the months after the first arrival of the newcomers, and you notice that the familiar rhythms of the city have changed. Some neighborhoods are almost normal. Women grind maize at dawn, children chase each other along the canals, fishermen mend nets with the same steady patience their ancestors used for generations. But other neighborhoods feel hollowed out. Doors remain closed, conversations are hushed, families speak softly about fevers, coughing, and the strange new illnesses that have appeared like unwelcome shadows. You soon learn that sickness is spreading. Smallpox, a disease carried unknowingly across the sea, reaches the basin of Mexico. It moves quietly at first, then suddenly with terrible speed. You pass homes where relatives tend to the ill with wet cloths and whispered encouragement. You see healers mixing herbs, applying salves, and reciting protective prayers that their ancestors passed down through centuries. But most remedies do little against this new and devastating sickness. It does not care about noble lineage or warrior training. It moves through palaces and marketplaces alike. You hear that entire families have been lost in some districts, and that the city's leadership is thinning as well. Even the rulers, those who once seemed distant from everyday hardship, are not spared. Still, despite the sickness, life continues. It has to. The city cannot stop feeding itself, repairing its canals, tending its fields. But you feel the tension rising. People speak of omens again. They ask whether the gods have grown silent. They wonder if the strangers brought something more dangerous than weapons. Then news arrives that the newcomers have fled the city after a violent conflict, but they have not left the region. Instead, they gather allies, many of them local enemies of the Mexica, and prepare to return. You walk to the shore where a group of workers is constructing defensive barricades. They stack stones, weave wooden frames, and prepare traps along the lake's edge. These are ordinary people doing extraordinary work because they know what is coming. Across the water, you see smoke rising from distant towns, signs of alliances forming, and the early stages of a campaign that will reshape the entire region. When the siege begins, the city shifts into a new kind of existence. one defined by endurance, scarcity, and the slow erosion of hope. You watch canoes being commandeered for defense. Warriors take positions along the causeways. Women and older children carry water, grind grain, and patch clothing worn thin from constant use. The lake becomes a battleground. Raids occur at dawn and dusk. Arrows strike the water with hollow thumps. The causeways, once symbols of connection and stability, become contested spaces. But even under siege, the daily resilience inside the city persists. A farmer from the Western District continues to tend a shrinking chinampa plot, pulling invasive plants with hands cracked from work. A potter keeps shaping vessels from clay because her family needs to trade whatever they can. A small group of elders meets each morning to recount old stories not for entertainment, but to remind the young that their identity does not vanish in crisis. Food becomes scarce. Clean water becomes more precious than obsidian blades. People ration carefully, sharing what they have with neighbors. You see a woman offering half of her stored maize to an elderly man who has no family left. Acts like these, unrecorded, uncelebrated, become the quiet backbone of the city's final months. But as the siege continues, the strain deepens. The newcomers and their allies cut the causeways. They destroy the aqueducts. They seize control of the lake. The city that once felt surrounded by protective water now feels trapped by it. You watch people gather at the canals each morning, waiting for the remaining canoes to return with whatever food they could salvage during the night. Some return with small catches. Others do not return at all. Yet still, you notice something remarkable. The city fights not only with weapons, but with memory. People speak often of their ancestors, of the long struggle that built Tenochtitlan from muddy islands into a powerful Altepetl. They remind one another that survival has always been difficult. They talk about how their grandparents shaped the Chinampas with bare hands, how their great-grandparents carved the early causeways, how resilience was never optional. These stories do not repel the siege, but they give strength to endure it. When the final assault comes, it is slow and devastating. Street by street, district by district, the defenders are pushed back. You see families fleeing deeper into the city, carrying children and small bundles of belongings. You see warriors making last stands in narrow alleys. You hear the confusion of battle echo through the canals. By the time fighting reaches the central precinct, the city is nearly unrecognizable. Buildings crumble, smoke thickens the air, the lake reflects flames instead of starlight. And yet, amid the destruction, you witness moments of humanity. A warrior offering water to an injured friend, a mother shielding her child from falling debris, an elderly man reciting prayers that were once used to bless harvests. The fall of Tenochtitlan is not a single event. It is a long, crushing unraveling. And when the fighting finally stops, the silence that follows feels heavier than the noise that preceded it. But this is not where the story of Mesoamerica ends. You walk through the ruins in the aftermath and see survivors gathering what they can. They sit beneath broken walls, rest beside canals filled with debris, and speak softly about how to rebuild their lives. Many are grieving, many are sick, many are exhausted, but they are not without direction. Because long before the rise of Tenochtitlan, the peoples of Mesoamerica endured droughts, migrations, warfare, volcanic eruptions, political collapses, and countless other challenges. Their history is not a straight line, it is a series of transformations. What survives after conquest is not just the memory of an empire, but the living cultures of millions of people who carry forward languages, traditions, foods, stories, and identities that are older than most written histories in the world. You follow a small group as they walk away from the ruins toward the Chinampas. They kneel in the soil, turn it over with simple tools, and begin planting seeds. This quiet act, humble and easily overlooked, feels like the true continuation of the story. And so you leave the basin of Mexico with a final question lingering in the air. When an empire falls but its people endure, what shape does the next chapter of history take, and how much of that future still lives in the traces of the past beneath your feet?